This is not how industrial dominance collapses. There are no factory closures announced in dramatic press conferences, no bankruptcy filings that make headlines, no moments when it becomes obvious that an entire manufacturing sector has been rendered uncompetitive. Instead, advantage dissolves through tariff structures that raise costs without generating revenue, through supply chain reconfigurations that happen in spreadsheets rather than on shop floors, through the quiet recognition that markets once considered captive have become inaccessible. Most people believe American aluminum tariffs represent trade protection, an attempt to shield domestic producers from foreign competition, to preserve manufacturing jobs, to reduce dependence on imported materials. The language used in policy announcements encourages this interpretation. National security concerns, unfair trade practices, strategic industry preservation, the vocabulary of economic nationalism, rather than strategic miscalculation. History recognizes something different. When Washington imposed tariffs on Canadian aluminum, framing the measure as protection for American smelters, it was not defending domestic industry. It was testing whether continental manufacturing integration could survive the disruption of supply chains that had been optimized over decades for cross-border material flows. The answer, visible now in production data and market share statistics, is that it could not survive, but the casualties were not where American policymakers expected them to be. To understand what occurred, we must first examine the nature of aluminum production in ways that transcend the basic economics of tariffs and trade barriers. Aluminum smelting is not a process that can be relocated quickly or replicated easily. It requires enormous quantities of electricity, specialized infrastructure that takes years to construct, and proximity to either bauxite deposits or reliable shipping routes for aluminum ore. When these factors align in specific locations, they create production advantages that persist for generations, regardless of short-term policy changes. Canada possesses structural advantages in aluminum production that American tariffs cannot eliminate. Hydroelectric power from Quebec and British Columbia provides electricity at costs that fossil fuel-dependent American smelters cannot match. The infrastructure for aluminum production, built over decades with both public and private investment, has been optimized for efficiency in ways that new facilities cannot quickly replicate. The technical expertise, concentrated in regions where aluminum production has been the primary industrial activity for generations, represents knowledge that exists in no equivalent concentration within American territory. American aluminum tariffs, implemented with the stated goal of making domestic production competitive with Canadian imports, created immediate cost increases for every American manufacturer using aluminum as an input. The automotive sector, which depends on aluminum for vehicle lightweighting to meet fuel efficiency standards, saw input costs rise by margins that could not be absorbed without price increases. The aerospace industry, building aircraft that require aluminum alloys with specifications that only certain smelters can produce, faced supply disruptions and cost escalations. The construction sector, using aluminum for everything from window frames to curtain wall systems, experienced project delays and budget overruns. According to early indicators from manufacturing sector analysts, these cost increases did not generate corresponding benefits for American aluminum producers, because the tariffs did not address the fundamental competitive disadvantages that American smelters face. Canadian production costs, driven primarily by electricity prices, remained lower than American costs, even after tariffs were applied. The tariffs simply transferred money from American manufacturers to the Treasury without making American aluminum production economically viable or reducing American dependence on imported aluminum. The timing reveals how thoroughly American trade strategists misunderstood the dynamics they were attempting to influence. The tariffs were imposed during a period when global demand for low-carbon aluminum was accelerating, and when European and Asian manufacturers were specifically seeking suppliers who could certify that their aluminum production used renewable energy rather than fossil fuels. Canadian aluminum, produced almost entirely with hydroelectric power, qualified as green aluminum that commanded premium prices in international markets. American aluminum, produced largely with coal and natural gas electricity, did not qualify for these premiums, regardless of tariff protection. This matters because it transformed the tariff from a trade barrier into a market signal that redirected Canadian production away from American customers toward international buyers willing to pay higher prices for certified low-carbon aluminum. Canadian producers, facing tariffs that reduced profitability of American sales, invested in certification systems that allowed them to market their aluminum as environmentally superior to alternatives. European automakers, under regulatory pressure to reduce supply chain carbon emissions, began sourcing aluminum from Canadian suppliers, rather than from closer but higher carbon European or American producers. Draft assessments from Canadian trade officials suggest this market repositioning was not accidental, but rather a strategic response, designed to use American tariffs as justification for diversifying export markets that had been too heavily concentrated in the United States. By framing the shift as a necessary adaptation to American trade barriers, Canadian producers avoided the perception that they were abandoning American customers voluntarily, while simultaneously building relationships with alternative buyers who offered better long-term market prospects. The secondary effects cascade through supply chains in ways that American tariff designers did not anticipate. When Canadian aluminum smelters redirect production toward European customers, they establish logistics relationships with European shipping companies, European distributors, European manufacturing clusters. These relationships extend beyond aluminum to other Canadian industrial exports, creating trade corridors that reduce Canadian dependence on American market access. When European manufacturers source aluminum from Canada rather than from traditional suppliers, they build procurement relationships that persist even if American tariffs were to be removed. This is where leverage quietly changes hands. For decades, American manufacturing sectors could influence Canadian industrial policy through the implicit threat that access to American markets might be restricted. Canadian producers, dependent on American buyers for the majority of their output, understood that challenging American trade preferences would invite retaliation that could devastate Canadian industrial employment. The dependency created a dynamic where Canadian industrial policy aligned with American manufacturing interests, even when this alignment contradicted Canadian economic advantages. If the current trajectory holds, this dynamic inverts. As Canadian aluminum producers diversify into European and Asian markets, Washington loses the ability to shape Canadian industrial decisions through threats of market access restrictions. The smelters that once prioritized American customer relationships now operate with order books that route through multiple continents. The shipping infrastructure that assumed aluminum would flow south to American manufacturers has adapted to vessel capacities and port facilities designed for transatlantic and transpacific trade. The strategic calculation becomes different for Canadian industrial planners. Aluminum production represents significant employment in Quebec and British Columbia, regions where few alternative industries could provide comparable wages or utilize existing infrastructure. By demonstrating that Canadian aluminum can command premium prices in international markets without depending on American access, the tariff response provides political proof that resistance to American trade pressure is economically sustainable. This matters because it changes negotiating dynamics across all industrial sectors, not just aluminum. The European dimension adds complexity that American trade strategists appear to have miscalculated entirely. As the European Union implements carbon border adjustment mechanisms that will tax imports based on embedded emissions, Canadian aluminum produced with hydroelectric power gains automatic competitive advantages over aluminum produced with fossil fuel electricity. European manufacturers, facing penalties for sourcing high carbon materials, are contractually committing to Canadian suppliers for long-term aluminum purchases. These commitments represent billions in revenue that will flow to Canadian producers, regardless of American tariff policies. Unconfirmed reports from trade negotiations suggest American aluminum industry representatives have privately lobbied for tariff removal, recognizing that the measures have damaged American manufacturers without benefiting American smelters. The economics are straightforward. American aluminum production capacity has not increased under tariff protection because the fundamental cost disadvantages remain unchanged. American manufacturing sectors that use aluminum as an input have experienced cost increases that reduced their competitiveness in global markets. Canadian aluminum producers have diversified their customer base and now operate with less dependence on American market access than existed before tariffs were imposed. This is not a crisis, it is a reordering. American manufacturers paying higher prices for aluminum inputs experience this as margin compression and competitive disadvantage. American workers in manufacturing sectors that became less competitive due to input cost increases understand this as job insecurity and wage stagnation. But from the structural perspective that defines how industrial power actually moves between nations, this represents the quiet transformation of a Canadian industrial sector from American market dependency to global market diversification. The infrastructure investments reveal the permanence of this shift. Canadian ports are expanding capacity for container shipments to European destinations. Canadian smelters are installing certification systems that meet European carbon accounting standards. Canadian logistics companies are building relationships with Asian distributors who want access to green aluminum for manufacturing supply chains. Each investment assumes that Canadian aluminum will serve global markets rather than primarily American customers, and each investment creates path dependencies that will not reverse even if American tariff policies change. The timing connects to broader patterns of Canadian industrial repositioning that have been developing across multiple sectors simultaneously. The aluminum market diversification follows the beef trade redirection that reduced agricultural dependence on American buyers, the water export refusal that asserted resource sovereignty, the defense procurement diversification that reduced military technology dependence, each decision individually defensible as adaptation to changed circumstances. Collectively, They represent the systematic construction of Canadian industrial capacity that functions independently of American market access. American trade policy has no effective mechanism to reverse this development because the standard tools of trade pressure have been rendered inoperative. Removing tariffs would reduce costs for American manufacturers, but would not compel Canadian producers to abandon European and Asian customers who pay premium prices for certified low-carbon aluminum. Imposing additional trade restrictions would further damage American manufacturing sectors that depend on Canadian aluminum imports without creating viable American production alternatives. The fundamental problem is that Canadian aluminum possesses characteristics, specifically its low carbon production profile, that create market advantages which American policy cannot eliminate through tariff structures. The market dynamics reinforce Canadian advantages in ways that compound over time. As European carbon border taxes increase, Canadian aluminum's price advantage over fossil fuel-produced alternatives will expand regardless of American tariff policies. As Asian manufacturers face pressure to reduce supply chain emissions, Canadian aluminum will become more valuable in markets that American producers cannot access. As global climate regulations tighten, the hydroelectric infrastructure that powers Canadian smelters will represent a competitive moat that widens with each policy change that penalizes carbon-intensive production. History does not reverse because it is misunderstood. The American manufacturers who built supply chains around Canadian aluminum imports will not regain access to pre-tariff pricing, even if tariffs are removed because Canadian production has been redirected to customers willing to pay more. The industrial relationships that structured North American aluminum trade for decades will not reassemble because all parties have adapted to configurations that serve their interests better than previous arrangements. The assumption that Canadian industrial output would remain primarily oriented toward American markets has become obsolete. By the time American industrial policy institutions recognize what has occurred, the reordering will be complete. Not through trade wars or industrial confrontation, but through the quiet accumulation of international customer relationships that make American market access optional rather than essential for Canadian industrial viability. The supplier that American manufacturers assumed would always prioritize their needs has become something different, not hostile, not refusing to trade, but sovereign over its own industrial decisions, in ways that American tariff policy can no longer determine.